All right, we are back and recording this session. We're recording it live in Sunday afternoon to be released for download shortly, tomorrow I would imagine, on Monday. And this is probably going to be the marathonist, if that's even a possible word, of our interviews, as we started out with the first hour going into some World War II issues that came up. The second hour, we started off with the Battle of L.A., which still dealt with some World War II as you went into the beginning of the space, and now we've been talking about the secret space program, starting out very, very much at the beginning, still back to World War II, moving outward, and now we have talked about this X-20, the plane that, quote, was never built, unquote, going about terrorizing other people trying to get into space. And that sounds about right, given the stuff we've heard about World War II. I'm telling you, Douglas, I mean, I'm not attached to any kind of government or any kind of state thing, but what you're saying really makes, while the world is full of despots, boy, it really makes this one pretty bad.
It's the worst. It's the worst that ever existed. There's no other government that's equivalent to this. We're talking about a government which has slaughtered millions of people from the Philippines all the way to Iraq, and beyond that, launched a war against humanity itself. And I'm always kind of amazed at what's going on in the Mideast now. It's like, wait a minute, how's this? Well, this is actually, they're showing their true stripes, really. Well, it's no different from any of their other ways of waging war. During the War of Filipino Resistance, what the Americans call the Filipino Insurrection, there are damning quotes that can be found to this day and age by people who do the research, where the Americans are saying we have to kill them all, meaning every single Filipino, just as they later would about the Japanese, and where Americans interviewed at the time said we have to exterminate every single Japanese person. I mean these were published as official American objectives. The Americans, if they had had their way, I wouldn't be alive, and billions of people would not be alive. So thank God the Americans lost the war in the Pacific. Thank God that they got their asses handed to them. And what happened when the Japanese invaded American airspace with super dirigibles, and they were loaded with these biocidals that forced the Americans to sue for peace? They called up Dr. Robert Goddard, and they said to Dr. Robert Goddard, after the bombing of Hiroshima, Emperor Hirohito launched the flight of the Sacred Cranes, the Sacred Crane Task Force. And 4 of them were launched. 3 of them made it. One of them crashed in the Mexico-Texas border. The others made it to the Tonopah Army Airfield in the zone known as Area 51 today. The Americans took the biocidals for analysis to Camp Dietrich, now Fort Dietrich in Maryland, for analysis, where they found out that just like one container of the biocidals in these dirigibles, if properly distributed around the planet, could kill every man, woman, and child on the face of the earth. And these dirigibles were loaded with tons of them, and there were over a dozen more waiting in China if the Americans didn't sue for peace. So they called up Dr. Robert Goddard in Boston, Maryland, and said, hey, Dr. Goddard, we've got dirigibles overhead here at Tonopah Army Airfield that are over 1,000 feet in diameter, loaded with biocidals, just like you said we got to watch out for. What do we do? And he grabbed his chest with both hands and he died. And you can look that up as to the date of Dr. Robert Goddard's death. The task force, the Flight of the Sacred Crane, was launched after the Americans went nuclear at Hiroshima, reached America, violated American airspace, got to Tonopah Army Airfield at the day the Americans bombed Nagasaki, August 9th, 1945, and Dr. Robert Goddard was promptly informed, they're here. Everything you said would happen, happened. And he died that day, August 9th, 1945. So, you know, this is the kind of stuff, again, that never makes it to the history books. And they asked Admiral King, Ernest J. King, the man who was in charge of all naval operations. He was to the Navy exactly what General George Catlett Marshall was to the Army, Supreme Commander of all of the Allied Forces, Commander-in-Chief Army. He was Commander-in-Chief Navy. And so when he was asked, what do we tell the Americans about this, the public. He said, don't tell them anything they don't need to know. When it's over, tell them who won. Actual quote. People can look that up.
Well, I mean, look at Iraq and Fallujah, etc. I mean, what I'm trying to get across here is that what you are saying may be amazing to people, but if you take the emotion out and just look at it, it is routine. It's routine throughout history till now. You see, this is the routine way of doing it.
Well, beyond that, I mean, like when Private First Class PFC Bradley Manning of the United States Marine Corps he was openly gay. He was apparently serving as, for lack of a better term, a prison bitch to several high officers, generals and colonels and the like. Was constantly told Obama was going to repeal the Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Wasn't happening fast enough for him. Felt he was betrayed. Turned over all these records to WikiLeaks. He's naked in jail the rest of his life. Literally naked. They won't let him have any clothes because they claim he'll use them to hang himself with. This is a form of torture. This guy's kept like that. And all of the documents that he gave to Assange, what do they say? Well, basically, the meat of it all, the key point was that we've killed over 1 million people in Iraq. You got to ask yourself, I hate to say this. You would have to be incredibly naive. I am really tempted to say you'd have to be an idiot not to have assumed we've killed over 1 million people in Iraq by now.
There's a lot of assumptions. This also explains why you have a group of people who are in the, let's say, they're in the conspiracy / UFO community who are dissing Assange and his group as being a stooge because they're releasing things that are wanted to be got out by another group of people, and it could be because what is being put out there, a lot of some of the stuff is not what they want to hear.
Well, there's that element, but you know what? The sad part is Americans don't really care. That really is not part of the question. There's no, other than, say, very conscientious Americans, and they are out there. I know that. I count many of our listeners amongst them, I'm sure, who care. But the reality is most Americans don't. I mean, they're told that we've killed 1 million people in Iraq. Give me a break. Throughout the frontier wars, Americans read in the newspapers every day of another Indian massacre. From the end of the American...
You're right.
Yeah, all the way up until World War I.
Well, it saddens the hell out of me for whatever good it does. I mean, I actually feel the oppression that's going on in the world, and it's very hard for me to function if I focus on that, because there's not a lot I could do in a big picture. In a little picture, I could do what I can do like this, and as I talk to other people. But it is terribly a weight on my soul that these things are going on. Mm-hmm. By the way, just for the heck of it, I found the name of this plane that's supposedly up there now being some kind of robotic police plane, which would be a improvement on what you were talking about. It's the Boeing X-37.
Cool.
There are actual stories about it still being in air. It was a secret release, a secret launch, and an unclear plan. It supposedly landed, but then there's evidence that it's still flying, and so on.
Yeah, it's always like that. There's always these convoluted stories about cancellations of these black budget programs. These people have no oversight. They can do anything they want. If they didn't do something with your money, other than spend it on strippers and hookers and bars, I mean, to give you an example of the attitude of these people and what they think of you, basically when they were confronted with the Glenn Dennis, the Roswell mortician, who was talking about the coffins that they were ordering for the child-sized bodies at Roswell, basically the Japanese aeronauts, then what happened was the United States Air Force came out on television and they said, oh, well, those baby caskets were basically used by the officers at Roswell to transport whiskey and other alcohol on airplanes. And it was a smuggling technique they learned to foil the enlisted men from pilfering the goods. Now, everybody knows at Area 51, why do we know about Area 51? Because everybody who works at Area 51 goes drinking at Rachel, Nevada. That's their watering hole, and they spill their guts out when they get pig-faced drunk. That's why all the Cubans and the Soviets and the Chinese all hang out for years at Rachel so they can find out everything that was going on at Area 51. Now, so you have legitimate bars where people can go to drink at these military bases. They even have bars on base for people off duty. So what are they telling you when they tell you they're smuggling alcohol? By the way, they put this into a History Channel documentary where the Air Force said this was their official explanation for those caskets. So what are they telling you? They are telling you that the only effing atomic bomber wing, theoretically, what they claimed in the world, their officers were drinking on duty. That's what they're telling you to your face. Because there's no other reason for them to be smuggling alcohol unless they're drinking on duty. Can you tell me any other conclusion you can reach on the basis of their explanation? There is none. That's what they're telling. That's what they think of you. That's what they think of the money you pay them. So if they weren't doing something with the money aside from drinking and whoring and gambling and playing golf, I'd be sorely disappointed. At least they're doing something. But at any rate, in terms of the combat that the astronauts of the Odysseus program, what were known as reserve astronauts, were seeing in space with cosmonauts, they were dealing with all kinds of problems. Basically, people in space need life support systems that not only provide air, food, and water, but regulate temperatures, humidity, pressures, light, noise, vibrations, and radiation. And such requirements would be difficult to satisfy for armed forces on extended deployments. Well, they had to learn to contend with this. Now, Wernher von Braun designed for the Americans the ultimate in rocket technology boosters that carried them to the moon. He designed rockets that were so powerful that once they were launched, just on the basis of their inertia alone, they could ultimately take men all the way out to Pluto. And it would take years, maybe decades, to go out that far towards the Kuiper Belt, but they could have done it had they put their mind to it. That's how powerful these rockets were. Now, where are all these rockets now? They're the most powerful rockets ever built. They're so huge. They're so incredibly large. There were no hangars that could fit them. So they don't exist anymore. Or rather, their rusted hulks and frames exist, rotting out in the wind and the elements and the rain because there's no place to store them. That's how big they are. That's what became of your program to go to the moon. They went up there 12 times for a propaganda and occult operation, never did anything again, established no bases, and ultimately that was the distraction from the combat that was going on in space. That's the kind of rocket, however, that took people to Krunia, not the dinosaur. The dinosaur was a combat vehicle, not a long-range transport vehicle. And that kind of rocket would carry a 1-month supply of oxygen, food, and drinking water just for a crew of 3. So we're talking about more than a ton stored at the expense of precious propellant and military payloads. So each crew member, in turn, also deposited an equal amount of waste products in the form of feces, urine, perspiration, internal gases, carbon dioxide, other exhalation vapors that could quickly turn toxic in sealed capsules unless quelled, expelled, and sterilized. That's the life support systems that basically had to be developed at that period of time. What we got now that currently dumps or stows organic waste on short missions, none of that did anything to alleviate long-term resupply problems. And therefore, we were able to reach a very limited area geographically in space. So that's what left us to the Earth-Moon system and Krunia and the liberation points. That has been humanity's battlefield for orbit in recent history. And so the risks to the human central nervous system for these astronauts were basically having to contend mostly with solar flares and other eruptions on the sun, as well as general ambient radiation in space.
So if I can interrupt you for 1 second, some things are popping in my head. Now with this information of this, and I want to get into more detail about the actual fighting in space, but now that I have this infrastructure of this weaponized space, and when I ask questions like, well, how come when the Japanese, the European Union, I want to say China, I think, and I think maybe Australia, they all sent these advanced surveyors to the moon. None of them has ever photographed where the U.S. has landed. Do you think that there might be a caveat as like, look, if you go up there and you announce things that we don't want you to, then your craft will never get back? Or, I mean, is there some kind of blackmail that will let you go there? Otherwise, but if you do something we don't want, we'll destroy the craft?
There may very well be something like that. I doubt that would deter most nations in this day and age. The American empire is in decline. The American empire is dying. The reason everyone in the world speaks English while nobody back in the United States does, or less and less people do, is because it's like Latin. It's a language of a dead empire. Everybody agrees to speak it because the empire is no longer a threat. And so we're talking about a situation where, sure, there's been general agreements. After the Americans did what they did with Operation Argus, which decimated the Third Reich in space, on October 31st of 1958, the United States and the Soviet Union began a moratorium on the testing of nuclear weapons. And so definitely at that point they realized that the ultimate result of this was that they had made space impossible to colonize or fight in if they kept lobbing nukes at each other. So they weren't dealing with anti-gravitics or the advanced propulsion systems of the Third Reich in exile. They weren't dealing with atomic power or propulsion systems. So they're fighting each other with comparatively primitive World War II technology, and ultimately it came down to knives and wrenches. That's what it ultimately came down to out in space. So when we're talking about all of this, the other nations really have no interest in finding some stupid American flag. I don't mean that the American flag.
I mean, my reason why I'm saying I don't know all these, unless everybody is dirty. It's just that the USA was dirtier. It's like, why are they exposing things like this? Or is it just because who cares? I mean, no one will.
Yeah, that would be the attitude. It's like I said about the Japanese military historian who's contracted by the Americans, or the Japanese submarine commander who's asked to testify against an American commander. I mean, does it matter to them the Americans destroying themselves? I mean, it's like this.
I guess I'm looking for a non-existent. The idea of like truth and justice and all that stuff. I mean, somewhere on this planet, somebody's got to care about someone else taking the pipe because someone else is a bully. I mean, I don't know. I guess I'm really naive and got my own delusions.
There will be a karmic justice in this. For instance, it's now generally recognized that the Vikings, the Norsemen, were here long before Columbus. So people will say, and of course it's becoming more and more recognized, that the Japanese, the Chinese, and many other ethnicities were here long before the Vikings. So at this point in history, things are coming around that people discovered the New World long before there was a so-called European discovery or a Columbian discovery. So same with the Vikings were the first to really colonize Vinland, Northland, in Labrador, etc., Grönland, and all these areas. And yet when they never were able to capitalize on it.
I mean, but when you look at the Vikings, for example, just for coincidence, my ancestry is Norwegian. I mean, you read about the Vikings; they weren't exactly real pleasant people.
No.
and so it's like, how could someone go, I'm proud to being Viking heritage? Really? You're proud that these guys were strong, pillaged, raped, all this stuff. I don't understand the heritage thing when you go back to it. Everyone was killing everybody all over the place. I mean, I feel like I'm in a dream world here where it's just like rape, pillage, and steal is what life is. And then there's these nutcases running around here and there who like to have freedom and justice and friendliness and
Well, certainly the Christ figures, the Gandhi figures, the Buddha figures stand out because they are such a minority. And the very term Viking means to rape, to pillage, to plunder, to kill. Yeah, it was an adjective. It was an adjective. Let's go Viking. Yeah, that was the very term for it. But this doesn't necessarily how would I say it? Not to condemn the Scandinavian races, but my point was beyond that. My point was that they were unable to capitalize on discovering and colonizing America first, and they were here. As a matter of fact, they were probably the cultural source for the Indian sweat lodges. The Indian sweat lodges are almost certainly inspired anthropologically by the cultural root source in Scandinavia, where they have sweat lodges. So we definitely are sweat homes, houses, etc., rooms, sweat,
sauna.
Anyhow. So my point is that what did this do for them in the long run? Not really anything other than bragging rights. And the people who later exploited North America more fully or profitably were France and Spain and Britain. Now, the same with the moon. Yeah, the Americans landed on the moon, one of the first. No one's going to remember that. In the future, you're going to have Chinese, Japanese, German colonists up there, and somebody will bring up, hey, the Americans are here first, and they'll say, yeah, you're kidding, that's a myth, just like people used to say about the Vikings. That's where the karmic justice will come in.
Yeah, well, it's karmic in one way, but to me, karmic is you pay for it, not just the truth coming out in one way is not just the,
They're paying for it now with my speaking. They're paying for it now with my talking about this. I mean, certainly the astronauts of the Odysseus program paid for it. They found out that the human central nervous system, blood, digestive, reproductive systems were particularly vulnerable to space radiation, which assaults reproductive cells. Delayed effects included leukemia, solid tumors, cataracts, and infertility. Certainly, normally that would in this day and age retard military recruitment and retention programs. But in those days, nobody was informed about what would happen to them. So basically, these days we'd have to have flight plans that would limit time in the Van Allen belts and hopefully forecast or warn of acute solar activity. But that in those days that would have reduced military flexibility, and the cosmonauts suffered the same kind of callousness on the part of their governments. But one of the things we found out, if it's worth it, was that the permissible exposure was on a sliding scale. Personnel under the age of 35 could tolerate higher levels and recuperate more quickly from radiation than older persons, but older people are better able to withstand moderate overloads for longer periods. So there's all this difference of who can take what in space. Now, when they're battling each other, how did they do it? Like I said, they couldn't maneuver in space like in Star Wars, where you've got these spatial dogfights replacing aerial dogfights. So what they had to do was basically calculate orbital altitudes and take on the Soviets that way. When a Soviet capsule was basically in orbit around the Earth, then the American dinosaur, more like a plane, would soar over it and just drop a whole cloud of ball bearings. And the Soviet capsule could not turn or stop and would run into the ball bearings, which at the rate it was going, it may as well have been running into a brick wall, like a freight train. And so it would shred the capsule, expose the cosmonaut within, rip the fabric, rip their guts out, and burn them alive in solar radiation through direct exposure while, exposing them to decompression. So that's what these men were doing out in space. That's the kind of combat that we're talking about.
It sounds like something. It sounds like the mentality of like Vlad the Impaler.
Well, it is the mentality of medieval combat. And what did we discover? We discovered that you can survive in the vacuum of space for a very short period of time. You don't explode. You can survive because we had astronauts and cosmonauts battling each other, and they couldn't use firearms because they don't work in space. They didn't have particle beams or lasers. And so what did they resort to? Knives and clubs. Essentially, they're wrenches. And what did they find when their faceplates were shattered? You have to expel all the air from your lungs prior to decompression. Imperative, you don't hold your breath during decompression, just as a scuba diver has to remember to exhale as they ascend from the depths of the ocean. You have to do the same prior to decompression, because a sudden drop of external pressure will cause any air remaining in your lungs to expand rapidly, resulting in the shredding of the soft tissue of those lungs. So it was also recommended all astronauts chew gum. All astronauts were gum chewers. And the reason for this was because of basically the air pressure in the ears what's only a minor annoyance from flying in airplanes or driving in mountains becomes deadly. Blocked ears can pose a serious problem in space. So air pressure in the middle ear, it's got to be remembered, it's usually the same as your outer ear. The eustachian tube, which is a narrow channel connecting the middle ear with the throat, opens periodically in response to swallowing or yawning, allowing air to flow in or into or out of your middle ear, effectively equalizing the pressure. If that eustachian tube gets blocked due to a common cold, allergy attack, or sinus infection, explosive decompression can result in space in a ruptured or perforated eardrums. So they chewed gum to help keep their eustachian tubes clear. And if that didn't work, they would try to clear them by gently exhaling while holding their nostrils closed and keeping their mouths shut until they were able to make it back into the space capsule or the dinosaur. And so definitely they had to prevent themselves from panicking. These were men who had incredible nerves of steel. And so like no other time in their lives, they had to remain focused on the task at hand. I read the debriefing after battle combat report of one American Odysseus program reserve astronaut who, because his cable had been cut to his dinosaur, had to use his chewing gum, removed it from his mouth, stuck it on the side of the dinosaur, and was able to hold himself to the side of the dinosaur while he used a wrench to open the hatch and get back inside, and then close it, and was able to re-equalize pressure and survive to get home. I mean, that's the kind of combat that we're talking about. Don't ever let go of the spacecraft. That's why they all had cables that they were cutting with knives on each other, because space is a zero-gravity environment. Once you drift out of reach of your spacecraft, there's no way you can get back. That's a hell of a way to die. You don't need to be decompressed or have your faceplate smashed in. You'll smash it yourself at that point, because you'll be drifting forever in space until you basically dehydrate. And, it's wildly flailing your arms won't move you an inch. The third law of thermodynamics states that for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. But unless you have something to push against, ergo, either a piece of debris from the airlock or something of that nature, to set you in motion back towards the spacecraft, you'll continue drifting in space forever. And so that's the kind of this kind of environment that they were contending with. So basically, the whole idea was wrenches to hold on to the hull of the airlock hatch, even when it was closed. Basically, you can tap on the hull, tap out an SOS for people who are still inside, so that if there's some way they can let you in, you can perhaps rescue yourself with that. But these were literally dozens of debriefing reports that showed me what they were dealing with. I mean, certainly, when your bare skin is exposed to direct sunlight in space, you get severe sunburn without the protection of Earth's ozone layer to filter the harmful ultraviolet radiation out. The exposure to sunlight caused third-degree burns in less than 30 seconds. And the temperature in space otherwise is very cold. It's below 455 degrees Fahrenheit. It's minus 455 degrees, basically minus half a thousand degrees Fahrenheit out there. But you're not going to instantly freeze because heat doesn't transfer away from the body very quickly. So you've got enough to worry about in the 15 seconds of consciousness you have left after your faceplate is smashed than turning into a human icicle. I mean, this is the kind of things they found out the hard way. And once they got back inside the aircraft, how long did it take them to recover? Short-term exposure to space resulted in temporary blindness, coughing, painful swelling. And so basically, you were out of commission for quite a while once you made it back in that craft drifting. And then you would reorient yourself and get back to Earth if that were still possible. So other than that, you've got about 60 seconds in space once your faceplate is smashed. Death is guaranteed in about 2 to 4 minutes, but you will remain conscious for about 10 to 15 seconds of useful consciousness. So you can still perform manual tasks with some degree of dexterity. I'm hoping I'm giving everybody a better picture of the amount of time that this combat was taking place in for many people. But you don't explode. your skin and blood vessels are strong enough to prevent this from happening. So direct exposure to space for half a minute won't cause any permanent injury.
Yeah, I know. You're saying you got about 15 seconds. I mean, talk about a disciplined, well-trained response to be able to go, I have 15 seconds to get back in this craft. That's amazing.
Yeah. Well, a lot of astronauts couldn't. And especially the cosmonauts took the highest fatality rates. Because the Americans were the predators, the hunters, and the cosmonauts were more like merchant ships in the time of the Battle of the Atlantic, trying to make it through to support various space stations like the military Soyuz. And but definitely another myth is that blood boils. It's true that body fluids, including blood, boil in a vacuum, but only in the sense that these fluids turn to vapor. And that was observed by the astronauts when they would stab cosmonauts, or when astronauts were stabbed by cosmonauts, is that blood would come out in crystalline form in mist around them. And but blood boiling is not an immediate problem for those faced with a vacuum of space. It's not going to vaporize within the period that you remain conscious.
Yeah, you're talking 15 to 20 to 30 seconds anyway. So I mean, you're coming up with a new thing, which is like, well, you don't actually explode right away, but you will die within 30 seconds.
Well, what's interesting is that astronauts were able to observe the fact that when their faceplates were smashed in, the saliva in their mouths began to boil first. Then the skin and the underlying tissues started swelling up to twice their normal size. But this was not life-threatening, and it reversed after recompression.
Mm-hmm.
So,
because I'm thinking of the movie Schwarzenegger movie. He was on Mars, where his eyes bulged out, and all this stuff, all these fictional portrayals.
Right. Well, again, we're talking about the closest thing to space combat. Think about the scuba divers fighting each other underwater in Thunderball.
If I can go to Mars for a second, it seems like this battle is still taking on, it moved out of space into Mars. It just seems very interesting that the Russian scientists have landed probes on Venus, something the United States scientists have not been able to do. But for some reason, every Martian trip to Mars ends up with a catastrophe.
Well, let's look at it this way. Remember those two smaller planetoids, Phobos and Deimos, which they dignify with the name of moons when it comes to Mars, but won't do so for the Earth-Moon binary planet system when it comes to Krunya. Well, there is more than those two moons on Mars. Basically, in Martian orbit, there's at least one tiny but homicidal third moon out there somewhere. The last photo taken by one of those Russian Phobos probes before it lost contact with Earth in 1989, people can look this up, Phobos probe, it showed a telltale streak across the picture. This was not a camera glitch. This was a very tiny, fast-moving moon zeroing in on the spacecraft that ultimately just basically demolished it, disintegrated it on impact. Now, if there's one moon that does that, there must be more. There might be dozens, maybe hundreds, orbiting Mars. Now, can you imagine paying billions of dollars to send men to Mars to have them shredded by moons that you haven't charted? Now, take a look at all the battles from our own space program. What's left? They talk about space trash. They keep talking about space trash to the point where they have to calculate every launch of the shuttle, every launch of everything they put out into space now to avoid all the debris in space. Where the hell did all this debris come from? Our battles in space. The military refers to it as the detritosphere. D-E-T-R-I-T-R-O-S-P-H-E-R-E. Detritosphere. And the detritosphere was created by their smashing all these cosmonauts into space. There are bodies in the detritosphere. There are bodies that are orbiting planet Earth by the dozens, if not scores, of dead cosmonauts and some astronauts floating in the detritosphere. And any one of these tiny fragments of smashed spacecraft and spacesuits could crash into a shuttle or a satellite and rip it to shreds because of the impact and the speed, the inertia, everything else involved. So this is the kind of environment that America has created for future people to contend with. All this space garbage and debris, and it always just shocks me. It just astonishes me where nobody asks where that comes from.
Yeah, well, there's plenty of trash from all the trips up there to account for it.
Yeah, well, think of the launches that must be going on. Secret, covert military launches in the Soviet Union, now no longer with us, and the United States, soon no longer with us. And you have an example of where it all comes from, combined with the combat that they conducted against each other. And that's the environment our future generations will have to clean up. And so, okay, I think that pretty much wore me out. We talked from 8 a.m. to 12 noon, Western Pacific Daylight Time, and I think I'm spent for the day.
Well, it is been a long haul. Just, I guess, in summing up, the secret American space program actually was something more like a dirty James Bond novel, in that you're having these individuals fighting out with basically stone knives and bearskins up in the atmosphere, which is not to take away from the toughness of somebody having to do this type of thing and survive, but it was far from glamorous, and the secret space program is, once again, falls in line with the history that you've been setting right, and it's history that's out there if people can look for it, that it's basically a pretty dirty thing.
Yeah, these men never saw their families. They sacrificed any semblance of domestic life. These reservists, their pay was unremarkable. The demands were ridiculous. The end result, though, was, as I said, they logged in more space hours. Basically, an example of one debriefing that I remember was 36 hours stationary orbit over Kazan, 21 hours. You know, this kind of thing would be notes I would take from these documents before I incinerated them. And think about what I'm saying, 40 hours. That's longer than Gordon Cooper was up in space, who the public knew about, one of the glamour boys. And what kind of world did this take place in? We're talking about the 1960s. What was the 1960s like? There were no photocopiers. There was no Scotch tape. There were no personal computers. There was no erasable ink. There were no cell phones. There was no satellite imaging. There was no videotape. There were no cassette tapes. There were no CDs, no computer graphics, no big screen televisions, no digital watches. And unless you were involved with NASA, there was no Velcro. Astronauts had Velcro. And if it wouldn't have burned up in the atmosphere, they would have wrapped their spacecraft in Velcro and their space suits in Velcro so that they could stick to it rather than float away in space forever when it came to these combat missions. They actually would have fixed Velcro to their ass on their spacesuits, and Velcro on their seats in the ships, so in no gravity situations they wouldn't fly out of their seats or float out of them. Microwave ovens didn't exist. There was no GPS, global positioning systems. There were only about 4 or 5 channels on TV. No cordless phones, no portable radios. Most electrical appliances didn't exist, and most items whose names include the word instant just weren't even conceived of yet. There weren't even realistic cinematic special effects when our boy who had done, Stanley Kubrick, was employed by the U.S. government to help direct fake shots of landing on the moon, just so that the public would have a good visual to look at, as opposed to the real lunar imagery, which was very difficult to see. He basically used these matte sheet backgrounds of painted sky, spacescape, and they had this big wooden frame in the back that actually would show through because the pressure the wooden frame would create against the matte cloth that was overlaid on the wooden frame, and you can clearly see it for what it is. And Richard Hoagland will tell you that's crystal structures on the moon. That's the giant crystal buildings. And so again, no realistic special effects for the day. Live reporting of major events anywhere in the world was quite rare. And, there was no inexpensive Asian-made cars or flavored potato chips, vacuum-preserved dinners, except for astronauts and cosmonauts. And there was no aluminum cans. I mean, this is the world in which they were confronting each other in space, not with particle beam accelerators, not with firearms, but with knives and wrenches, killing each other like cavemen, severing each other's cables so that they could float away in space forever.
Not a very glamorous picture, but see, war is never glamorous. And one of the things I don't like is how people reminisce about the good old days of World War II. There's nothing good about them. And you've even made them more clear that if anybody does harbor some type of bizarre, I don't know what the word would be, reminisces about that of World War II and the camaraderie and whatnot, that it was people killing each other in the most uncivil, inane, unhumane way, which we then imported into space.
Yes. Yeah. And it's that is something I want people to remember, that I am the only person who has ever spoken to this. And compare and contrast. Compare what I'm saying to what other people tell you, and intuitively, innately, ask yourself who rings true in what they're saying. And
one I have to, what you're saying, I have to admit, fits the psychopathic profile. If you actually strip off all the emotion and look back at it, it fits the profile. It does not surprise me if I don't. Once you break your paradigm free from the programming, both either if you want to look at it as patriotic or if you want to look at it as in an ethnic sense, referring to an American, white America or whatever. If you want to look at it at Christian America, or if you peel all that off and get down to the actual evidence, is barbaric, and actually the word satanic would fit better because of the anti-human aspects of it, which would fit the satanic profile. And it's pretty sad.
Indeed, but we can make it better. And
now that's a show I'd like to have with you. How we can make it better.
Well, one way to make it better is to confront it first.
Yeah, you're right. You have to know of it before you can change it or change course from it. That's true. And unfortunately, like you said, there aren't many people. There are nobody else that I'm aware of talking about this. So this is still brand new, and I'm still interested to see. I get your rise as far as people. More and more people hear this from you. I'm interested to see what happens to you along the way. And again, I've said it before. I said it on the air. I've talked to you privately. What hope you bring me is the incompetence and the degeneration of the system that has been doing this, so that hopefully they will disintegrate. And of course, look at Rome. Look at other aspects. They have disintegrated under their own disgustingness over the years. So it's kind of like going out with a whimper rather than a bang, but they're leaving a lot of trash behind them.
Yeah. And maybe sometime in the future we can speak more to Unterland and the 1,000-Year Reich in Exile. I would like to remind everyone that I did speak to that in the Deutsche, or German language, for an 8-hour Skype interview, much like this one, conducted with Nexus Magazine, United Germany. And that was taken by Thomas Kirschner, who turned it over to the transcribers. And, of course, in English, Nexus Magazine is published out of Australia. It was outlawed in the United States because its alternative health advertisements ran against the grain of FDA. And so the FDA shut Nexus Magazine for a while at least out of the United States, but it's one of the most widely read alternative information periodical in the world otherwise. And so I am truly internationally recognized at this point to many people reading of what I said. throughout the British Commonwealth of Nations, such as the former dominions of Canada and Australia.
Yeah, in fact, if I can interrupt here, I'm looking at the Nexus Magazine website. Right at the top, first thing, Douglas Dietrich on the Hidden Side of History, Part 2. Right at the top.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, they took 8 hours. They transcribed it into pages and pages of transcription, and finally had to narrow it down and edit it down to 8 pages an issue. It's a bi-monthly periodical every 2 months, so I'm literally, as a 3-part interview, in there for 6 months, half a year. So part 1 has already been out. Part 2 is currently out, but you can get part 1 as well as part 2 by checking out www.nexusmagazine.com. Nexus is spelled Nexus. Again, that's www.nexusmagazine.com, and you can even electronically subscribe and receive electronic downloads of the magazine, or physically get the magazine, etc., including the other issue, which has that interview. The 3rd issue hasn't even been edited and come out yet. The 3rd part of this interview, I will be working on that with Duncan Rhodes. He's the editor of Nexus Magazine. I will be working with his editor, with his professional adult supervision, Ruth Parnell, a wonderful lady in Australia who will help me make the 3rd issue possible quite soon. But, imagine what was taken out. We had to take out an interview like this. Imagine narrowing that down to about 32 pages. I mean, that's the kind of challenge that we're facing. And my interview with United Germany was twice as long. So that's the kind of challenges we were facing. And people ask me all these questions. Oh, well, what about this? What about that? And I'm like thinking, well, it's a pity we couldn't get the whole article, transcribed, all of it verbatim. But that's life, and I want you to the public to check on that, because
it's $1. You can download the issues. You don't have to have a subscription. You can download. I think it's $1.50 a piece for the digital issue. So
Great.
You could, and it has written here. Hold on. It has your part 1 and part 2 available as a download for $1.50 for each one.
Excellent.
So.
Excellent. And keep in mind, I'm not making any profit out of that. This is just part of getting the truth out. I truly am not making any profit out of that. I would like to emphasize to people to please check out www.douglasdietrich.com and check out the DVD set which we are selling, and that will help support me. Definitely, my mother died directly as a result of what I did that day when I gave the lecture Roswell and the Rising Sun. We did it on the run. We did it covertly. We didn't even have a movie screen to put the images on. But Mr. Jancik has seen it himself, and hopefully what images do show up on the screen, at least I think he'll agree with me on this, are still visible enough where you can certainly see what I'm referring to. We're discontinuing the DVD package as soon as all of these currently remaining DVD sets are gone. They will never be reissued again. Because the one DVD, Roswell and the Rising Sun, which led directly to my mother's death, will analog into printed text format, will probably be undergoing cinematic exposure at some point to counter military industrial propaganda films like Independence Day and the Battle of Los Angeles. And the other DVD in the set, Satan's Crusaders, I plan on delivering the same materials or materials pertinent to the subject of that DVD at the 2nd Super Soldier Summit, Super Soldier Summit number 2, which should be taking place in March of 2013. Very shortly, comparatively speaking, simply half a year after Super Soldier Summit number 1, the first ever event of its kind, as opposed to a full year after. So if you want to find anything else about these DVDs, just remember we're offering 2 of them for the price of 1 until depletion of supply. Check into my website, douglasdietrich.com, and also UFO Con 2012, I'll be speaking to Roswell and the Rising Sun, which all of this served as the background story for. This puts it all into context, what took place, the war crime, the atrocity at Roswell, and the satanic propaganda campaign instigated to cover it up. Literally satanic, as it was orchestrated by the officially recognized satanic chaplain of the U.S. Army, Colonel Michael Aquino, who I served as liaison for almost a decade. So I hope that puts everything into perspective. We started off about 10 or 15 minutes after 8 a.m., Pacific Daylight Time. We're closing down now at about 12 noon, 15 minutes after Pacific Daylight Time. So I think we pretty much got exactly 4 hours worth of recording time in, pretty much.
Yeah, and we went across the board answering questions earlier on a couple items from World War II and Battle of LA, and it all seems to stem out of World War II. Whatever we talk about on these topics, it always goes back to that, because you have to set the record straight because it's corrupted.
Right. Yes. Well, I want to thank you so much for mentioning that, because consider this. Ufological phenomena has been parallel and parcel to human history forever. As long as mankind's been around, there's been strange lights in the sky. The ufological phenomena has been a part of the human experience. So I want you to know it exists. There is and are ufological phenomenon. But what took place between World War II up until the 1970s in decreasing increments with each decade, 45 to 55, 55 to 65, 65 to 75, we had an enormously different ufological experience. One that was mechanistic, one that left bodies, one that left wreckage. In Ely, Nevada, E-L-I, I believe, or E-L-Y, you can correct me on this, Nevada, that was a town where Ansel Adams used as his headquarters, from which he photographed all of the Rocky Mountains and made a name for nature photography. He helped pioneer it. In Ely, Nevada, there was a quote-unquote UFO crash of Japanese prisoners of war where 17 bodies were recovered. And you never hear of this, but if you look it up, you'll find out what I say is true. And that Hotel memo by Guy Hotel, Hotel, which is something that they started talking about after I started talking about Roswell. As soon as I started talking about Roswell, they started bringing that up. Well, books were publishing information on the Hotel memo back in the early 1990s. Before about 1994, there's a book called Book of UFOs, Complete Book of UFOs from the Y Files. WHY, it was the name of the Y Files back in the old days, long before X Files and all that other crap. These guys were pioneering paranormal research, and they were talking about the Hotel memo in a published book back in 1990.
16 bodies were found.
Oh, there you go. Yeah. And one Guy Hotel, an officer with the FBI in Washington, D.C., gave this memo to J. Edgar Hoover. He's talking about a crash with so-called flying saucers or discs where bodies are recovered in March 22nd of 1950. Has nothing to do with Roswell. And everybody somehow uses this as proof of Roswell. I mean, it's sickening. I mean, well, tell me, are all of these aliens crashing in the Four Corners region because of the mushrooms or something? I mean, are they parking and popping some psilocybin with the local Hopi tribe and then getting up into space and really, not handling the controls right? I mean, what's the deal? Obviously, these are Asian prisoners of war that were never returned. All of the Asian prisoners of war that were interned in prison camps in the United States were interned in camps that were opened in 1945. Fort Tracy, Camp Cochran, Camp Bakersfield, Camp Lamont, all in California. And they were open until 1947, the year of the Roswell incident. And who was in there? Everybody remembers the prisoners of war from Europe, the Deutsche Afrika Korps, various other kinds of prisoners from Germany. There were 425,000 of them in the United States for half a decade. 53,000 Italians. Nobody remembers there were 5,000 Japanese, 5,000 Koreans, and 5,000 Taiwanese who never went back home. And that is part of your ugly history that they are covering up by saying they're aliens. When you see those pilots in Independence Day, when you see those helicopter pilots in the Battle of Los Angeles, that's not CGI. Those are real military personnel flying those aircraft. The military is not going to back your movie up with that kind of firepower unless you're saying something they want you to say. And what are they saying? They're saying it's all aliens. As opposed to pickled Asian bodies that they've got in labs down at Area 51.
You know, since I've talked to you about this, and we'll close with this, yeah. I got from a gift from my sister a doll, a dummy, I don't know how to say it, of the Roswell aliens hanging up in a thing, which was kind of novel. You know, put it out for Halloween and stuff. But after having the shows with you, as I look at that, I can clearly see the caricaturized, Asian features, yes. And it becomes not too cool anymore.
Yeah, it becomes rather morbid, and that's what Sergeant Melvin Brown, who was at the Roswell site, was told not to look under the tarp, and he looked, and Melvin E. Brown later told his family, when men were walking on the moon on television, as a matter of fact, in 1969, he turned around and he said to his family, in that July of 1969, he said, I was there at Roswell and we were dealing with enemy aliens. And he described the body. He said, they were yellow and they were burnt orange and they turned gray with rigor mortis. And his family turned around and said, aliens! Look at what he's saying! And they automatically interpreted that as extraterrestrial. Et cetera, et cetera. We've been over this before.
Yeah, right. It's the paradigm. It's your worldview. When someone says that, hey, that's cool, does that mean it's cool, cold, or does it mean it's pleasing to the eye or to the concept? You need to have the context, and his context was back in the terminology of the day, and their listening context was in the post Roswell alien context now.
Yes, they were victims of a totalitarian state which had indoctrinated them with propaganda of dehumanization. And that is the environment we're still contending with. This is for Asians what African Americans were contending with for ages. And so the African Americans have, in my opinion, succeeded to a great extent in making themselves accepted and in helping to eliminate stereotypes and caricatures which were offensive. Now it's the time for Asians to do so. And in that sense, Americans are truly in denial because they've been through this once before with the civil rights movement, and they can't stand to go through it again. Well, that's tough because the Asian immigration wave has since superseded the Hispanic immigration wave in the United States. There are now more Asians coming into the United States than there are Hispanics or Latin Americans. So you're going to have to adapt. So that's reality, and that's life. It's time to grow up. And part of growing up and maturing is getting rid of all these fairy tales that a gruesome group of literally satanic war criminals has fed into your mind. And so I definitely think that's a good note, if not a bitter one, to leave off with. But I certainly want to give you the last thought so that we can say goodbye to the audience, and you can,
my last thought is that I made a decision years ago to seek truth, and one of the things that I've learned along the way, that when you find truth, while it does set you free, that there's a moment when you see it, it's naked, you know it's true, it's against what you thought it was true, and you have that moment. And what are you going to do in that moment? Are you going to accept this possibility and look at it, investigate it, or are you going to throw it off quickly because it's too painful? And that is that moment that we're all going to be in our lives, personally, as a race, as a country, and as a world. And what you are doing is greatly appreciated, even though it might not be pleasant for many. If you're going to throw off the oppression that's on us, you have to know it's there to begin with. And what you're doing is a commendable work, relatively thankless. I know you're not some kind of a spoiled rich kid trying to make a name for yourself. You're struggling. And you could have easily assimilated with your intelligence and the knowledge. You could have assimilated into the UFO community and started to charm an audience and pull some of these shots. But you chose to go for the truth. And for that, I and all of us, thank you very much.
Thank you.